Apparently recording is in progress. Sorry. Oh, by the way, we were going to be really slick and have like a microphone and do the whole thing. And then it broke at the very last minute. So I hope that we sound okay. We're doing our best.
Thank you for understanding and your support.
So welcome to this talk, which is exploring the comic storytelling toolbox. It is being presented by NYC Resistor, which I am a member of. So going to give you a little bit of context here for those of you who don't know. NYC Resistor is a hacker collective with a shared space located in Brooklyn, New York. It was established, I believe, in 2008. We meet regularly to share knowledge, hack on projects together, and build community. If you're interested in joining NYC Resistor, or if you want to just learn more about the space, get a tour, talk to some other members, we have a public craft night twice a week that you can sign up for ahead of time. We're very good about pandemic safety. We kind of up and lower the how insanely cautious we're being based on case numbers. We're a very responsible space. And you can also sign up for a class. We have classes pretty regularly. A lot of them are very affordable. And you can find info about all of this at nycresistor.com. Also, before we start, I want to have a reminder that, like all events hosted by NYC Resistor, we ask that we are, the presenters, and we ask that you, the audience, in the chat, adhere to our code of conduct, which our friend Carey Love, the other Carey, second Carey, is going to. Well, in this, you are the presenter, so you are prime Carey in this moment.
I'll take it temporarily.
Secondary Carey will be putting that in the chat for us right now, so you can check that out. So behave, please. We will kick you out if you don't behave. Thanks, Carey. So do you want to introduce yourself and then I will introduce myself?
Yeah, sure. So hi, everybody. I'm Carey Pietsch. I'm a cartoonist. You might know me from my work on Lumberjanes or Mages of Mistralia, and currently I'm the co-adapter and cartoonist on the Adventure Zone graphic novel series. You can find me online at careydraws.com and at Carey Draws pretty much everywhere, and I'm very excited to be here. And you, Ben?
I'm Ben Wilgus. I am a cartoonist and comics writer and comics editor. I am Carey's editor on the Adventure Zone series, although we do know each other previous to that. I've done a lot of things over many years. Most recently, I have a book called The Mars Challenge from First Second Books, which was illustrated by Wyeth Yates, which is about human spaceflight. I have a book coming out next year from Random House Graphic called Grace Needs Space, which is by Rii Abrego, is the illustrator for that. It looks amazing because Rii is a genius, and we'll have more on that really soon. So big nerd hours going on over here.
in this chat, we're nerds here.
All right, let's dive into the talk. So we're going to talk for like roughly 45 minutes, and then we'll have time for Q&A at the end. If you have a question, you can hold it to the end if you want. If you want to write it into the chat, again, our dear friend, Secondary Carey, will be putting that into a Google Doc for us so we can see them all at the end. Your question will not get missed. If you don't answer it, it's because we ran out of time or your question was bad, in which case, just look at your choices and ask a better question next time. Sorry, I'm punchy. I like ran in here at the last minute. We're having a very authentic like con panel experience. This is very like San Diego Comic-Con. I got Chuck in human traffic and I'm like diving through and like running in right before the panel starts. The old mood here.
Thank you, MTA. You did get us here, but it was a struggle.
I did get screwed with the B train. Anyway, Carey, please tell us about comics.
Okay, so we're really excited to chat with all of you about storytelling in comics, or really thinking about how decisions serve the story at several different stages of the comics making process. So to break it down, like Ben said, we're going to have about 45 minutes of talk and then leave the rest for questions at the end. We might run a little bit over. We'll see how it goes. So we're going to start out. I'll talk about layout and color, and then Ben is going to talk about.
I'm sorry, I was supposed to say that. I'm talking about point of view and subjectivity. I'm going to talk about acting and time. I'm going to talk about lettering and voice. Great. So those are three rough groupings of stuff.
Yeah, it's all good stuff. I love we both love comics a lot, so it's very cool to get to talk about them. Quick caveat before we dive in, which is no rules, just right. I firmly believe that there's no one right way to make comics, and there's no hard and fast rule for what's going to be effective when. But I think the more you learn about how other people make comics, and as wide a variety of different folks as possible, the more you can improve your ability, expand your ability really to be deliberate and specific in your comics making choices and how they can support your story. And that's what making comics is really all about. So let's start by talking about page and panel layouts. So here are some of my own layouts. They are very messy. Layouts are the very first thing I do in the comics process. That's really when I'm thinking about the overall composition of the page, like a little bit about what's going to be in each panel. But my main goal is what is the overall page composition going to be like? I'm kind of using interchangeably paneling, layouts, and page composition. I'll try to stick with paneling, but bear with me if I swap them out a little bit.
Yeah, different people use the language differently.
Yeah.
So if you're working with somebody, for instance, and you're like, I'm not sure we're talking about the same thing, it's very normal to have to clarify some of this stuff.
Which is great, because again, there's no one right way, but also it means you need to figure out how to get each other on the same page, as it were. Aha. So your tools at that very first stage of comics, when you're thinking about the overall layout, are things like your panel size, panel placement, panel shape, your border style, and also your text placement comes into layouts, which Ben is going to talk about a little bit later with lettering. So all of that adds up to, again, your overall page composition. So I want to walk through each of these one at a time with examples of how you might use them for effective page layouts that really support your story. So starting out with panel size. So in general, panels are the unit of time in a comic, and there's kind of this direct relationship between how much space a panel takes up and how long it takes to read. So big panels take longer to read overall. Again, that's not a hard and fast rule, but just generally speaking. A big panel can also mean this is an important moment, pay attention. Maybe it's something dramatic and tense, maybe it's an establishing shot, maybe it's a change of tone or pace. And small panels tend to read much faster, so you can use those to build up and break a rhythm or create tension or just kind of to get through a scene. So looking at this page from Octopus Pie the Other Side, here's a really clear example of small panels being used for shorter moments and then a larger panel taking longer to read. So these two small paired panels show this character expression changing as he realizes something, and then this larger panel is a much longer moment of his contemplation, just kind of looking up at the sky. I think this is a really clear example because those small panels are grouped and the content is very similar, indicating that the point of these panels is to establish this moment-to-moment small shift. I think this is a really effective example because the reader kind of has to work from that expression to figure out what the emotion the character is experiencing in, which like forces your mirror neurons to activate and really sets off that empathy. But like that's a whole other lecture, so we will save that for another time.
I know this is very basic of me, but if you want to read a lot about like empathy and relating to characters, Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud is actually it's an old but a very good book that gets into a lot of depth about why cartoons are so good at, again, like why do I care about these lines? The whole thing.
It's very important. Okay, so let's next talk about how to decide what gets a large panel in your page. So again, this really depends on what the point of that page and panel is and how they relate to the story you're trying to tell and the information you're trying to convey. So on the right-hand side of this spread from Welcome to the Ballroom, which is the first page in this spread, we're reading right to left. The first panel that's the largest is an action shot. So the focus of this page is on the speedy movement and the kind of that heart-racing moment of the prospective character looking at this big quick step dance. So it makes sense that the focus would be on this action shot, and it gets the most literal space on the page.
Action ballroom, I love manga.
It is action ballroom. It's so good. I love sports comics. So it's taking up more than half the page. You can tell it's really important. The rest of the panels on that page all kind of support that moment, and the sound effects extend into it, which kind of really emphasizes how much space it takes up. On the facing left-hand page of the spread, the focus of that page is kind of on the drama of her partner's focus in this dance and his expression of like sheer complete intensity. So it makes sense that this close-up, which really highlights that, gets the most space. It also shows us that it's what the perspective character is looking at the most closely in that part of the scene. So on one page, the biggest panel is an action shot, and the other, it's a close-up. It all depends on what your goals are for that page and how they're factoring into the story you're telling. So next, let's talk about panel placement. So tiers of panels on the page, or grouped panels, so like a horizontal group of panels running all the way across the page, kind of implied that there are associated or related ideas that happen within this tier. Your brain kind of assumes that things that appear physically close together go together. It's like gestalt thinking. And this can be used to imply association between two seemingly totally unrelated things, which is a really cool tool that lets you get the reader to kind of close that gap and make that metaphorical.
Juxtaposition in comics is so important.
Yeah.
In terms of like images on the page and text.
And text and image, right.
Which we'll both talk about more. Over
Yeah.
the course of this, yeah.
But I feel like that's really why we all harp on show don't tell so extensively, is because you can do a lot more with text than just literally repeat what the image is telling you. Like that information is already there. I've gotten a hair into my own eyeball. Wow, this is the magic of live events. You don't get this in a recording. So tiers on the page, when there's a small set of sub-tier panels that are linked together vertically, like those panels from the Octopus Pie comic we were talking about before, it kind of works like a call and response. Like they're often meant to go together, but to be an aside or a small connective moment. So John by Gail Galligan has some really neat and clear examples of tiered groups of panels on this page. So the second tier of panels, panels 3, 4, and 5, are really this one complete thought. They show us this delayed conversation between two people, and then they cut to John's reaction to show that he's feeling totally out of place while all of this is happening. The third tier of panels is also a separate complete thought. It's a different moment of John talking with another character, and all three of those panels being on the same tier makes them feel like a mini scene together. Maintaining that same shape also helps you feel kind of stuck in this moment with these characters.
It's kind of almost working like paragraphs in this context.
Yeah, from a structural point, that absolutely makes a lot of sense, I think. One special category of group panels are inset panels, which are really all about context. So the panel that's inside the other panels implies that all of these panels are kind of sharing this moment in time or are happening really quickly together anyway. So there's a great example of this in Smallness. I feel like a lot of mech comics do similar things when you're like cutting to a pilot's face while you're showing everything their hands are doing. I love this one. Smallness is great. And here's another one in Delicious in Dungeon, where the inset panel 6 is set into a larger panel 5 with fuller bleed. I think here it's a different kind of really effective tool. It shows that this one thing, this character's expression is changing while the action continues in the background behind her. Sometimes I like to use insets. They are for leading into or out of larger panels, again, for that kind of like, not a microscope. You hold it up to your eye like a detective.
A magnifying glass?
Magnifying glass, thank you.
This
A
is why I'm here.
magnifying focus on that one
I
moment.
gotta earn my keep here.
We do this for each other. It's a tip of tongue error. You can use it to indicate a scene shift or as a small window or a moment in time. This page from Delicious in Dungeon is also, I think, a great example of panel angles helping to lead your eye through the page. So panels 2, 3, and 4, again, reading right to left, all guide your eye down to the "Stop You Fool" dialogue in panel 5. So in this case, the slanted panels are helping with reading order. Your eye follows up and down the slant, which makes it really clear which panels go together on this complicated page.
Sometimes people really stress out when they haven't read a lot of comics about whether or not they're reading the page right. And I like to say, like, if you have any familiarity with the basic mechanics of comics at all, if you're not reading the page correctly, it's not your fault, right? Yeah. Like a cartoonist worth their salt is very deliberately moving your attention through the page. And if you're confused, it's probably not you, it's probably the comic.
Yeah, I think a big part, it's definitely like it is a skill you acquire over time.
Yeah.
And I'm learning new stuff all the time, but I think figuring out how to effectively guide the reader's eye through a page is such a huge part of why layouts are so cool. And so like, they're the foundation, like that is the foundation upon which you're building the rest of the comic.
One sign of like somebody who's really good at comics is that they feel effortless to read.
Yeah, absolutely. Which is so cool.
It's really hard.
It's really, really hard. Really hard, but always a worthwhile challenge. So speaking of tilted panels, so in addition to the size of your panels, you can also vary your shape of your panels. So instead of being with these regular rectangles, you can kind of break out of that structure and use this angular or tilted paneling. So here's an example of tilted and angular paneling in Delicious in Dungeon, with this conversational page set against this dramatic, intense action scene. I love this comic. Everybody should read Yummy Dummy. It's so good. You can see that the cooking and conversation paneling on that page, it's much more regular and rectangular. And against that, the tilted panels of the action really stand out and show you that something has changed here. It's tense. Even in that conversational page, there is some angled paneling in panels 9 and 10, which is when the eggs undergo a phase change. So again, it's used to point out a moment of tension. It's just in cooking instead of fighting. And this really works because of contrast. If there weren't contrast, if there weren't those regular rectangular panels, it wouldn't feel nearly as dramatic. Another note about how angled panels can support not just that reading order and not just that story sense of tension, but also strengthen your action. So on this page on the right, where Laios is attacking the root of this plant, the panel shape is also used to strengthen the motion and direction of the action. You can see that the gutter and panel are tilted in the direction of the completed motion, and that helps your brain complete the movement of the active swing all on its own, even though what we're actually seeing is the end point of that action. It's so cool. I love that you can do this with comics. So speaking of panel shape being that kind of identical regular rectangle can also be a story tool. So in That Box We Sit On, Richie Pope continually uses these regular, repetitive, similar panel shapes and compositions really effectively to create this sense of being stuck in this moment with two characters. This is the comic where all the action that's happening is really taking place in the characters' conversations and in their interiority. So this is a case of this comic's grid and panel regular compositions are supporting the setting and story. It's all boxed in. Next up, let's talk about panel border style. So the biggest border style variation that I tend to work with is borderless or open panels versus closed panels. Again, this really depends on contrast to create meaning. So borders, we talked about before, how panels kind of delineate moments of time in comics. So panel borders are kind of these units of time borders. And open borders in contrast signify like this is a moment outside time. Really take your time with this. Like the focused character might be kind of stuck in a moment. I tend to use these pretty sparingly because again, that contrast is everything, but you want to use them when you really want the reader to stop and pay attention. They're great for establishing shots and big emotional moments like this one in Octopus Pie right after a love confession and a really dramatic conversation. You absolutely get the sense of a character being stuck in the moment and really sitting with it. Prince and the Dressmaker also uses it to really linger on this gorgeous debut of the dressmaker's new model in a new citrus dress. And that fashion illustration not only shows us how the designer is perceiving the moment, but also breaks it out as like, hey, really linger on this. This is something special. That last small panel on the left-hand page with those heels on the stage serves to literally ground the reader and also reminds you of the larger context the show is taking place in. But the focus of that page is really on that lavish dress illustration.
This is a really great example, and you can see, if your screen is big enough, you can see the line quality of the borders themselves. I think that borders are definitely something that can be really neglected by newer cartoonists. Like, it doesn't have to be a big thing, but you do have to think about it. It's part of the art of your page, right? Do you want it to be very heavy? Do you want it to be very basically invisible? Do you want to hand draw them? Like, you should probably do some tests and think about something. It's like anything else. It's like choosing your font. It's like choosing your pen. It is part of the language of your, it's a subtle one, but like it does make a difference.
Yeah, and you really want to take that time to figure out like what's the right feel that fits with the rest of your artwork too. Much like lettering, which I know you're going to talk about in detail later, but it's a deliberate choice that you're making.
But if you're doing something that's supposed to feel like a sketchy journal comic and the art is very like loose and fluid, but then the panel borders are very rigid, like that's going to communicate something. And maybe that's what you're trying to communicate, but that's why a lot of the time it can be a huge pain in the butt to be hand drawing a bunch of squares, but there's a reason why people take the time to do that.
Right, and especially if it's a comic with like this loose, brushy inking style, which is so beautiful and expressive, like Prince and the Dressmaker, I think it's a really smart and good fit. And you can see the lettering balloons have a similar organic quality to them, which is really cool. Yeah, great comic. Also, I mean, read all of these. I think everything we're talking about are comics that we love.
We're not going to waste your time.
Yeah. Oh, we should, I forgot to say at the start, there's a link in the email that you all got about the Zoom invite that has a Google Doc we compiled with information on all the comics that we're talking about, where you can read them and where you can buy them. So
I think there's like one or two that are out of print, but everything else you can get. And hey, by the way, the one or two that are out of print are minis. And if you want to email that artist and ask them, they might be willing to help you out. I just couldn't find a copy of it to link to.
Yeah. So read comics. They're great.
Sorry, go on.
No, please, this is what we're here for. So on the second facing page in this final panel, there are two characters breaking out of the panel border. So some of you can see the background is contained within the panel border, and the two characters are literally cannot be contained within it. So that kind of implies like maybe this moment is too large to be contained, or that the characters are more important than whatever else is happening in the background. It's this kind of sense of a freeze frame of the action while people keep moving. Also a quick digression, but look at how the middle tier on the second page goes together. There are these three fast small panels and these two longer ones framing it. These three small panels of the audience reaction happen so quickly in time, but they're also this tier of a complete idea. You can see the dressmaker go from not knowing how anyone else will react and being nervous to being caught up in enjoying it, to not really thinking about it, to slowly understanding that everyone else is applauding too, which is really cool. Also, I'll get to more color in a second, but this is a great example of using this limited palette to really push that crowd into the background to put the focus where it belongs, which is on that model and her dress. We'll come back to color later. In like one more slide. We're almost there. Panel borders. So another really cool thing panel borders can do is to be not like fully diegetic, but you can use a thing in the world of the comic itself to become the borders of those panels. So Our Dreams at Dusk has a lot of really lovely uses of this.
Do you want to define diegetic?
This
is a film student word. It's
video game. It's like
it's
a
of
thing
the
that
world.
it's a thing that you can. It's if in a movie the phone rings in the background of the movie, and the characters in the movie can hear the phone ringing. That's a
or
diegetic
music
sound.
is playing or something. It just means like it's part of the world of the thing in some way or another.
I counted this as a video game nerd, but I will not argue you on the film student thing.
I mean that's where I learned it.
Yeah,
I'm so sorry.
No,
Anyway, no, but it's one of
time.
those words that's really useful, and but you either know it or you're like, what are you talking about?
This is video games' fault for sure, for me personally.
Please go on.
So Our Dreams at Dusk does a lot of this in a really gorgeous way. So in this case, on the right-hand page, the first page in this spread, that final panel of the main character's defense is shattering is already a larger splash, and there's no gutter between it and the previous panel, which indicates that the two are connected, and it's therefore this like causal connection. On the left-hand page, the second in this spread, that metaphorical language of broken glass as realization is extended into becoming the panel borders itself. So these broken shards become the new panel borders, which kind of frames each moment as a piece of the larger realization this character is having about his queerness and context. There's another gorgeous example in I See a Night, where this horse's traveling trail dust kind of becomes a sequence of snapshots of these two characters growing closer together. And that loose structure kind of implies a drawn out nebulous passage of time in a really cool way. Man, comics, they're just cool. I really like the tool set. It's so expansive and people are doing new stuff all the time. Okay, let's talk a little bit about color. So color gives you several additional tools that you can use to help support your comic and push your story. First, there's literal color. You can use color to establish a setting, provide local color information and about the setting and its characters.
Time of day. Yeah,
time of day, lighting, that sort of thing. You can also vary the hue, value, and saturation in non-literal ways to do story things, to achieve story goals. So you can use that to push the composition of a page and lead the eye around it. You can group elements together or separate them. You can set up contrasts, you can add emphasis, and you can establish emotion and signify shifts in emotion and tone. Quick side note, I love grayscale and black and white comics. Black and white comics provide information about value or how light and dark any element on the page is. And that value information can also be figurative or literal. So grayscale comics and limited palette comics can vary that value to achieve all of those same ends that color comics can. There's nothing lesser about grayscale or black and white comics, they rule.
It's really frustrating that they have, adopting them in North America has been difficult because they're really fantastic. And frankly, like from process wise, they're usually faster.
And cheaper to print.
Yeah, so they're lovely.
Yeah, anyway, if there are publishers in the audience, please bring on more black and white comics. They're so good. So great to study and read grayscale, black and white, limited palette comics in and of themselves. And also because if your values don't work, your colors overall probably won't either. So I think it's really important to study them, even if your end goal is to work in color comics. So in addition to value, and again, that's how light or dark something is, color adds hue and saturation to your toolbox. This is really quick and dirty, but hue is like what we think of as a basic color wheel that you learned in like 5th grade art class. It's kind of the base pigment of a color or its casual color name like red, yellow, blue. And then saturation refers to how vibrant or vivid that color is, like versus how muddy and gray. So just like value, hue and saturation can also describe both literal and figurative information. So let's talk about some ways that folks can use these color tools for storytelling. So here's an example of managing informational hierarchy through color and being deliberate about what gets which color details or what level of detail you can balance busy areas and rest areas to really draw the eye around the page. So in Mel Gilman's Stage Dreams, I think this is a really cool example of a high detail color page on the left with all those gradual gradations in floor and table texture and garments set up against this rest area on the right-hand side. And I use scare quotes because it's deceptive. Like this is still all made with really dense, gorgeous, and lush colored pencils, but it's really that contrast of gradation against this deep night.
There's nothing says I made this choice deliberately, like coloring something in colored pencil.
Yeah.
It takes a really long time. You're not gonna waste your time here.
No, there's a really, really careful and deliberate choice. And in this case, like it sets this moment off so strongly. Because it really like there's nothing to distract you outside of these characters.
Melody did not like drag a gradient over this.
Yeah.
Casually.
No, this is
Melody blood, sweat, and tears, that gradient.
Yeah, and it's so good. It's so good.
No, it's so beautiful.
I could never. They're very
I would die.
powerful. Yeah, same. Color can also be used to group elements. So here's a case of not figurative, but literal local colors and local lighting being used for that same goal of grouping and story movement. So these local colors are designed to set up this contrast between characters who are going to leave this environment later, who tend to have these purple and blue elements in their clothing, versus characters who are associated with the home in this story in Salt Magic, who are associated with these orange and pink elements that are also in the background. Kind of unifying that background palette also groups all those background elements together and makes it easier to read the salient characters because they pop out against the background. So it's both having these story implications of who is going to stay and who is going to go on a journey, perhaps, and also helping you to read the page a little bit more easily. In this page from Diana's Electric Tongue, the background elements are kind of all grouped into this purple pink hue, which means they read as a separate plane, and that brings special emphasis to the pairs of characters in the foreground whose colors are really distinct. There's no distractions, you know what's important right away, and you still get the sense of this really cool, lavish wedding party. Great comic. All of these are great comics. I just stopped saying that, it's simply true. I See a Night does a similar grouping where the teal of the background is contrasted against the blues and oranges of the two characters in the foreground, which really pops them out. So figurative color can also be used to add emphasis. This Legend of Brightblade page uses these starbursts of bright white against a super saturated background to really strengthen the drama and magical elements of those panels. And then in the same I See a Night page, this fourth panel shifts into an orange background and teal foreground, which is a reversal of the pattern in the previous three panels. And that jarring shift really emphasizes and aligns with the humor of this sudden and jarring departure. This is a joke that is partly made through color palette, and I think that is really cool.
And I think this is a great example too. I'm gonna like move this up
Yeah,
and see
please.
it properly. Like the Brightblade page is great for, I think it's such a great example of like when we talked earlier about how important it is to like read a lot of different comics, not just the comics that you think you want to make, but like widely. Because like Ethan's work is really the example of somebody who definitely is like been informed by reading a lot of manga. Like this is not a manga style comic as we think of it, but like this kind of like starbursts and like, you know, the way these types of backgrounds are very much like it's a manga thing. That's like where a lot of us got it. So like you kind of can add things to your tool set, even if you're not going to be enacting them on your page in that exact style. It can like expand your vocabulary about how to create certain effects on your page.
Right, which is really what it's all about, is like figuring out what resonates with you and then how you can use it.
We're just continuously stealing and reinterpreting.
Right. I mean, you digest. It's going through a process of making connections against all the other neurons in your brain, and it bounces out different, which is really cool. That's how the human brain works.
You digest it, you make it a part of your body.
I literally tell people at the end of this to eat more different comics. So yes, spoilers. We'll get to that.
You gotta grow your comics bones strong.
Yeah, it's important. Okay, we talked about Legend of Brightblade. We talked about I See a Night.
So I keep derailing, Carey.
No, I
be
love
organized
it.
about this.
My brain is a sieve. I just need a second to get back on track. So shift in tone. Here's a really fun example from Witchy, which is combining not just color palette, but also border shape, border style, panel size, and panel shape to all really sell this dramatic shift in emotion. So it heightens the tension, and the color really sells that huge contrast between the desaturated purple palette on the left-hand page and then the next page. I think it's not technically a spread, it's the next page in the page turn, is this really dramatic, super saturated red-orange. So this spread from Dungeon Critters also uses figurative color to display a shift in emotion, in this case moving from like kind of despair on the left-hand page slowly into hope. Things get more saturated as more heroes kind of join the battle and all fight together. So I think that's a really cool, another example of how saturation variation alone can really do a lot of heavy lifting for your story. And one more example from Barbarous. I think this one is really cool because it shows how saturation alone can make such a dramatic difference. So the final panel in this spread where this character is falling is a super saturated heightened take of the palette from earlier. It's really the same kind of hues, but it's the saturation alone that really sells the drama of the moment. So that's it for me on layout and color, but now I'm very excited to hear from Ben.
Carey, not to break the fourth wall here, I desperately need you to get rid of this window.
I don't know how to get rid of this
window. I think you just have to click on it. If we if you unfull screen the slides, will you get your mouse back? Sorry. Yeah.
Great. Thank you again for bearing with us. Good call. Okay, here we
go. Carey's notes are more thorough than mine, so Carey could get away with not being able to see part of those slides, but I need to see my slides.
It's
I don't
important.
know what I'm doing. So hello, I also have things to say, although I'm largely, Carey did a lot of the heavy lifting here. I'm kind of building on the sort of foundation that we have laid here.
I think all of these are important and essential to the comics making process.
So, oh, by the way, side note, at this point in my life, mostly what I do is professionally I write comics and I edit comics, but I cannot stress enough, that I have drawn thousands of pages of comics, and I think that has made me both a better writer and a better editor.
Ooh.
And even if you're very, very bad at drawing, if you have any interest in making comics at all, you really need to draw some comics, even if they're bad and you never show anybody. There's no other way to really, there's a way that your brain is making choices. Just like when you write something out, like there's only so much you can plan a sentence out in your head before you actually have to write it on paper. It's the same thing with comics. Like, comics is its own language. You cannot just do it internally. You really need to see it on the page. You need to think about how much space things are taking up. You need to think about pacing, page strengths, all that stuff. So you got to make bad comics so you can make good comics. Even if you don't want to draw, even if you don't want to edit, if you don't want to draw, you should draw.
Especially if you don't want to draw comics, legally you should have to draw them before you can try to work with another artist or work as an editor.
Yeah, you need to have written
a mandate.
And then there's a bar fight, and then have to try to draw it and be like, oh, did I need to put this bar fight in?
There's no faster way.
How many people are in this bar?
Yeah. There's no faster way to really lock in the one action per person per panel than to write yourself a note that's like, and then they run across the room and pick up another character and throw that.
None of it can be Family Circus, where it's like Jeffy's like progress across the page with a dotted line.
Yeah, but anyway, the really cool thing is that bad drawing is a fake idea. Like, if your drawing conveys what you want it to convey, then it's a successful drawing, and that slaps. So if you've ever played Pictionary, if you've ever like drawn a little doodle for like a child in your life and they've been like, oh, that's a dog, then you are absolutely ready to draw comics. Comics are for everyone.
I can't stress enough that everything we're saying is basically about effectiveness of communication.
Yes.
If you're communicating effectively the story and the emotion that you're trying to communicate, then you've made a good comic.
Yeah,
basically.
like read Mob Psycho. Like that comics cartooning and storytelling are amazing.
Yeah.
And people who say that it's bad drawing are simply
stupid and
mistaken.
dumb.
I wouldn't go that far. I would say they're wrong.
Okay, well, you're nice with me. Anyway, time to talk about point of view and subjectivity. Speaking of opinions, so I'm kind of breaking my thoughts into sort of rough chunks here. So I also come from like a prose writing background too, so that's kind of the perspective I'm coming to with this. So, for instance, point of view and subjectivity. If you have any training, if you've ever taken an English class of any sophistication at all, if you've taken any writing classes, you've probably learned about like first person versus second person versus third person. Like, first person is I went to the store, second person is you went to the store, third person is he went to the store. Like, it's a whole thing. So I think that if you read books at all, again, if you've taken any English classes, you've probably spent some time thinking about different kinds of points of view and how they affect the reader experience and how you have to write them differently, how they communicate information differently. Comics is obviously different than prose, but you are still choosing your point of view. I think more comics tend to default to an omniscient point of view where you're sort of outside of everything, but I would argue that a lot of the time they're sort of doing that by default. And when you're making comics, you should be thinking about it just like you would if you were writing a prose book. Like, who am I with here? Whose experience of this, whose emotional and literal experience of this scene am I tracking here? For instance, if you want to have a very tight point of view character, even if you're not literally seeing everything from that character's eyes, do you only write scenes that character is present for? Are you ever giving the reader information that character does not have, right? You can have multiple points of view. You can move between different characters. Like, why are you doing that? Do you want the reader to have empathy for more than one person? Are you just trying to communicate information? Like, there's no right way to do this necessarily, but you should be thinking about it when you're making these choices. So anyway, I'm going to do a little bit about how some cartoonists have communicated point of view and character subjectivity on the page. I just remembered I have to click the button. I clicked the button. So this first one, I think, is what most people would think of when I said casually a subjective experience on the page. It might be something like this, right? So this is from Bubble. And in this page, a character has taken some alien drugs and is having a time.
An alien time.
An alien time. So there's a few things that are going on here. For one thing, there's a color story, as Carey was talking about. So in the world of this comic, alien magic, there's basically an alien magic that this particular character has, and that magic is coded as pink, right? Probably Jordan would be mad at me if I use the word magic. It's basically magic. You shoot pink energy out of your hands and attack people with it. It's basically magic. So that is a hot pink color. So first of all, Natalie Reese, the colorist, when she was coloring this page, by having it be very, very pink, 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 she's emphasizing on the page that this is connected to that same alien magic. These are alien drugs. These things are connected to each other. You're also, when Tony drew this page, he took the script, which described him as having this very trippy and disorienting experience, and Tony decided to have the reader empathy here be by being a very disorienting page to look at. Like he deliberately drew and lettered this. The lettering isn't in this particular copy of the page, but the lettering also rotates 365 degrees. When he was drawing this, he's like, so I want it to be that if you're reading this in a book, you physically have to turn the book around to read it. And if you're on a Kindle, you have to like turn your iPad. Like he did that on purpose, because for one thing, I think he wanted to make you really aware of like the space, and it's meant to be disorienting,
Right.
which again, like kind of grounds you in his experience here. And also it's very trippy, which is great. So this is a very literal sense of like, I am being put into this character's experience of the scene.
And I think the lack of borders also helps with that, right? Like to some degree, there's smoke and there's these special effects, but
there's a timelessness to it. This is like a very hazy sort of, he will have a patchwork memory of this later, which again, if you've ever had a time, I think this is a pretty good reflection of what having a time is. I have not done any alien drugs, but I have taken an edible once and became very aware of my own skeleton.
It's just
so
in
different,
there,
but yeah, anyway. So, but here's a much more subtle, but I still think very straightforward version of sort of character subjectivity. So in this comic, Shattered Sphere, which is a really excellent short comic set in the Neolithic era, it's very literal, but also very subtle what's happening here. So we're starting from the point of view of an unknown character who's approaching a camp at night. We're getting closer and closer. So we're in the eyes of the person who's approaching this camp. And then you see here in the third page here, there's a moment in the second panel where her eye opens. And I feel like that's a pivot in this series of pages, where in that moment, you're sort of in both of their points of view simultaneously, like you're getting closer to her physically, but now we're having this very intimate view of her sudden awareness of the situation that she's in. And the next panel, we're not literally in her point of view, but we're following her focus, right? It's very close to the ground. You can still see her eye, which is emphasizing, I think, that the fact that we're kind of grounded with her in this moment. See her grabbing the leg, and it's sort of this she just woke up, and right now all she's aware of what is literally right in front of her. And then the fourth panel, the fourth page, we are now once again grounded literally in somebody's point of view, as we're seeing like down the length of her arm what she would see as she's grabbing the leg of this woman who's just taken her bag. And what I love about this is that I feel like if the same scene was written this way in prose, it would be very difficult to do this in a way that wasn't awkward. Most Western books tend to be in either a very tight perspective within a scene, right? So like you're in limited third, you're in first person, like even if a book has more than one point of view, it tends to not shift inside of a scene most of the time. But this does it very seamlessly. You're never confused about what's going on, and it sort of passes the football of the perspective.
Passing the foot, yeah. Also, this is literally forced perspective to force a change in perspective, which I just think
this is great, yeah. So I feel like this is very elegant.
Yeah.
A little bit more complicated here is another comic by the same artist, Letters from Ricardo, The Silent Lord. This comic just came out.
It's really good.
Slaps so hard.
It's really good.
I have to say, I just cannot stress enough though that this is the third of 4 books, so be prepared for once again it to end on a horrible cliffhanger. But it's worth it. You should read it anyway. It's amazing. It's incredible. Read this comic. Anyway, all these comics are incredible. I just read this 2 days ago, so I'm like high on it. Like Mitch, I'm spinning through space and experiencing a time. So this is a really interesting mix of different types of expressing this character's subjective experience. So he's woken up from a nightmare. You're also seeing kind of the lettering here to express the fact that he's panting. So if you start out with like, again, very literally like his point of view, looking at his own hand, sitting up, looking at his own hand and his foot. We have a panel where it's not clear if he's in the bed or if he's sitting next to it, which I think is sort of is interesting. It doesn't really matter. It's giving you a sense of place. You're getting some context, like he's becoming aware, he's remembering where he is. And then you have the fourth panel where you're no longer seeing it through his eyes, but it's very grounded in his experience. Like he can't see his own face, but you're seeing that he's panting, seeing that he has facial hair, which if you had read this in context, he did not have last night. That's part of the information here. He's running his hands through his hair, which has grown overnight. And then you again return to his very very literal perspective as he's sort of stumbling across the room. You see him see the mirror and see, having touched his face and his hair in the last panel, he wants to see himself, so he's looking in the mirror and having this moment of like confronting the sort of chain. Again, it becomes a timeless panelist, borderless panel to sort of give you the sense of the fact that he's sort of like having this timeless moment. Then we go into a subjective, we're not clear if it's literal or not. Is he hallucinating? Is he seeing something that he's actually seeing that isn't there? What's going on? You get outside of him a little bit enough to sort of see him startling away, and then you pull the rest of the way out of his perspective to see the larger room, which both, again, gives you more context in terms of place, time, and also, you know, emphasizes how sort of small he feels in this moment, because he's very, very small in the page. So you're getting, it's very grounded in his emotional reality, even though it's now very far outside of his literal point of view.
Yeah, I think this is not a talk about background and environment design, but I think this is also a great example of deliberately controlling level of detail in the environment. Like there are times when drawing the environment would be a distraction, and in panels like this panel where the character is touching his own hair, and the panel where he sees himself in the mirror, it's a very deliberate choice that like, no, there's no outside environment here. This is a really intimate, focused moment of just this character's internal experience. So it's a choice not to draw background. That's also a choice that you make in comics, is are you going to draw the environment or not? Is it just about the characters, or is it about their larger context?
And in that first panel on the third page, you see there's a very, really huge, like very big shift in terms of the line quality, the rendering. Again, like that's startling, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, you're telling the reader this is important. It's disorienting. And this comic uses that kind of effect a lot in terms of like deliberately disorienting the reader, which I think is great.
Talk about that more in lettering.
I know.
I know you have one of those in here.
Speaking of disorienting the reader, so this comic is Mare Internum. So what has happened here is this character is in an underground lake on Mars, and has fallen into this water unexpectedly, and is having a different sort of time here.
But an alien time.
Yeah, so we're starting with these very disorienting views of his body in water. So this is not as much a like, we're literally in his point of view. This is more about like recreating his experience while being like outside of his body, if that makes any sense. So at first he's tumbling, he's untethered, there's nothing else, there's just him in the water, and then we have that very abrupt moment where he hits something solid. And in this whole sequence, Dersheng is using light very deliberately to sort of emphasize that he is perceiving a very small part of this very large and unknown environment. Like the light is diegetic, like it is literally there, but it's also representing like his awareness of the physical space that he's in and the situation that he's in. And it also makes this very large space feel very claustrophobic. Like we know that he's in this huge lake, but we also can feel how like limited and confined and small he feels like inside of the space. Also, and of course that continues throughout this entire sequence. A lot of these panels are very like vague and disorienting, with these very small areas of detail and like bright light, surrounded by a lot of murk and like kind of the unknown. It also emphasizes that like there are unknown dangers here. He's in an unknown situation, and you, the reader, are like, you want to see more of this. He's in an interesting place, right? But you're being denied this because Dersheng in this moment wants you to be feeling what he's feeling. Dersheng isn't trying to communicate the splendor and wonder of this underground environment. Dersheng is trying to communicate terror and and danger and a bad mystery, not a good mystery. This is a bad mystery.
This is a mystery that kills you.
And the light is also emphasizing the kind of moments of transition, like as he's experiencing, like the moment he makes contact with the solid ground, the moment where he finds a way out, like a piece of surface he can break through, the water breaking as he goes through it, the shore as he's climbing onto it, like all these transition moments are really highlighted. But then at the end, in this last panel, the light in the way that it's framed is also now emphasizing like a different kind of claustrophobia, like the very literal kind of being inside of this helmet. And what I love, and we'll get back to this later, but I love the use of lettering here in terms of the sound effects and his like gasping word balloon also being trapped inside of the helmet. Like it's such a very effective way of communicating like his very bad experience of this moment and how suffocating it is. And also like how fragile like his body is, like, because he's in the suit, and this last panel is like, I know you can't see him very well, but I really want to stress that like he is having a bad time. This is physically exhausting and damaging to him to be here. Just again, you really empathize with him.
It's really effective.
It's very effective. So this is the Less Than Epic Adventures of TJ and Amal. This is a very, very different way of using the environment to communicate somebody's subjective experience here. So first of all, by keeping all these 4 panels like very, very similar to each other, whenever you do something like this, you're really emphasizing everything that is changing. Like this is a particular kind of moment-to-moment storytelling, which I'm a big fan of, and I use a lot in my own comics, wherein when you're only changing a couple of things, the reader really pays very close attention to those things, and it means you can get away with some subtler stuff that might not read if more things are changing at the same time, right? If that makes any sense. So here, like the fact that the background is dropping away, like the seatbelt is literally disappearing, the background is getting darker. It's like that's this emotional experience of like this dawning moment of like a bad kind of realization. You're also getting this very subtle character acting with him, but if the panels weren't so similar, these very small shifts in his face, like you would not read them at all. They would just look like, oh, you're just seeing his face from a different angle, which I think is really effective here, which leads very nicely into the next thing I want to talk about, which is like acting and time. Like anytime you draw a character on a page, you are acting. But I mean, in a way, the entire page is also part of the acting, including the background. Right. And I think that the way that it interacts with time in comics is very weird and difficult. Yeah. Because like on a page prose, the reader is pushing through it, but the way that you're controlling how fast the reader is moving through a scene is very different in comics. So here's another page from T.J. Noel, which is similar in the sense that it's like very similar framing, moment-to-moment storytelling. What I like here is that like literally the only thing changing here is his body language, his face. And again, it's like your focus is entirely on him. You're paying attention to every little detail. And I think that this kind of storytelling is especially good in comics like this one, which are like, this is a romance story, but stories that are really much about like character relationships, subtle emotional turns and experiences. I think you can make really good use of this kind of paneling and this kind of acting in those kinds of comics, because it can be a very effective way to get across these small, quiet moments that are difficult to communicate otherwise.
Yeah, and this really is paneling and acting working together, like Ben was just saying, because it is the regularity of the panels is helping you really pay attention to, like you just said, what is actually changing here. If the panel shape is the same, the overall how much space the character is taking up in the panel is the same, like the overall body doesn't change that much, so it really highlights those subtle shifts in action.
And I think it's also really important to think about the fact that like you're also extending this moment, like breaking it out. Time. Yeah. When you're doing this, this is sort of just deceptive in how simple this is. Like Ike had to make a choice about exactly which specific moments that she was going to pull out and highlight here. And I feel like a lot of time when she draws these comics, she does pages and pages and pages of sketches, and often then like picks from them which ones are the ones she's actually going to make into the panel. And I think that's frequently the case with this kind of thing, because it's all about like you're freezing a specific moment in time. Right. So, sorry, I know we're running a little behind.
No, we're fine. We're just gonna run over.
It's fine. Yeah. We have to go to bed, so we don't want to do for this for 2 hours. But Carey's.
But we'll keep going.
Second, Carey isn't going to cut us off. So this is interesting because this is like a bunch of different stuff that we've been talking about over the course of this, kind of all going on at the same time. So this is a great example of how you can compress time. Like this is probably at least an hour that's supposed to be represented here, but while you're also emphasizing the specific important details of what's happening, but without making them too specific. This is a really interesting way of both being very specific and also like very general. So like, because there's no dialogue here, this isn't representing like a particular series of like back and forth conversation. This is representing like the whole conversation, like an hour's worth of conversation that you're sort of experiencing in these little moments that are sort of universalized, if that makes any sense, right? It's a really interesting way to do this, to be like, this isn't this one specific thing that happened. It's about like how she felt during this whole dinner.
It's representative of the larger experience in these couple small slices.
Yeah, we're seeing the arc of an evening here, which I think is great. I really love the use of the sort of white ribbon of the border here. Which I don't know if she did this deliberately, but I feel like it represents like the sort of thread of a conversation, if that makes any sense, like the kind of path that it's sort of taking. It's like a very interesting way to kind of break up the frame in a way that feels very organic. It's very hard to kind of, I like the softness of it, basically. Yeah. And I feel like it's, so what we have is we start with this kind of wider frame to kind of establish the situation that she's in. Also, there's a lot of information in the body language here. She's sort of you can tell that she is not being included in the circle of these people's conversation. Like, they're all focused on each other. They don't look happy, but they're also like, you know, they have their own conversation. She's outside of it. She's physically all the way to the left. She's looking down at her own drink. Nobody's looking at her. And then as we go closer into her and her boyfriend, so this is the dinner that she's having with her boyfriend and her boyfriend's parents. You know, you can see that she's looking at him, where her attention is. You can see the information that she's getting, that he's deliberately avoiding looking at her. And then we have this sort of these two moments of like moment to moment storytelling where she both, like, you can see that she's looking at her, then she's looking away from him. Like, what I really like about this is that, like, although again, we're not literally inside of her point of view, you can tell that she is the important character, and her emotional experience of this scene is the one that we care about. And we're sort of following her attention through the scene, which I think works really well. And you can also, I like that basically what this is doing is it's finding the most important moment in this dinner, which is the moment where her like discouragement really sets in, and the evening really takes a turn for her. Is like really highlighted by both being very large on the page, and also because I think that moment to moment storytelling is a way that you're telling somebody something's important. Yeah, a lot of the time. So this is totally in the other direction, which is this is almost like a kind of comics as montage thing where you're having a sequence that is meant to feel both, again, it's meant to feel both specific but also like general at the same time. So you can read it as like a literal series of events, right? There's this girl who's crying in class. There's a teacher who's taking pleasure in this and then walking through the hallway while other students are resentfully watching her. And then we return to the girl who has, after class, gone to the bathroom with her friends to cry and feel shitty and bad about this. Like, you can read this as a very literal, like, linear set of events. But because there's no specific dialogue attached to the particular characters, you can also read this as like, this happens all the time. Like, these are specific moments, but this is a pattern that is especially combined with the text on here, which is more general there, like about like a period of time, like I hated her then. This is like a period of time that this character went through. While we're seeing specific moments, I think it's very clear on the page that this is not a one-time thing. This happened over and over again. And again, I think that really thinking about whether or not you want to have diegetic dialogue in a specific sequence is something I think that people don't really necessarily think intentionally about as much as they can. Because like it's like how diegetic dialogue adds specificity and grounds you in a specific moment in time. And sometimes it's what you want, and sometimes it's not what you want. I think it's worth thinking about what you're trying to get out of a certain sequence in that way.
Right. Is it specific or is it general? Is it telling you this is how it was at that time, or is it this is how this one time was?
Yeah, it's
the collaboration, like so many comics.
And so this is interesting because it's very, very far in the other direction than some of the other comics we've looked at in terms of like the acting here. Like, this is a really great example of how you can express like a lot of acting and nuance with much more abstracted and stylized characters. Like, these characters are both functionally faceless. Like, we have this monstrous character who either has a mask or an expressionless face. And then we have a hunter character whose face we don't see. But it's very clear, for instance, at least in this sequence, that the monster is the sympathetic character. Like, we're with the monster when the hunter arrives. We see the moment when the monster notices them. So we start the scene in the monster's experience of the sequence, right? Like, the monster is the default, the hunter is arriving in the monster's space. And we are sort of starting off empathizing with the person who's sort of being intruded upon here. And you very clearly can see the moment of recognition. You can see the sort of timeless details in the second page of like, you have a weapon in hand, you have a plant that has splatters of blood on it. I love that this is basically telling you a ton of information in negative space, right? Like, you don't have to, this is not a comic about a fight. It didn't have to show you the literal like details of the violence being enacted. You sort of see how it starts. You see these two panels in the middle page that sort of represent like the period of time in which something very bad is clearly happening. And then you see the aftermath in this last spread. And that's what's important for this. But I don't think there's any doubt as to what is happening in that second page there. And I also really love, this is a great example. We were talking about contrast and juxtaposition earlier. Like, this is a really great example of like a juxtaposition between like dialogue and the images. The dialogue here is all very gentle. Like, if you can't read it, it's like, Seon, is that you? The other character says, yes, it's me. The monster says, I've been so lonely, welcome back. It's like very polite very neutral dialogue, but it's juxtaposed with like this incredible violence.
Mhm.
And I feel like that tells you a lot. There's a lot in that contrast. And what I love about this is that, like, I literally have this in my notes here. It's like, I am doing a bad job explaining this. It's like I'm explaining a joke, because the whole point of this is this was the most effective way to communicate what this cartoonist is trying to communicate.
Right.
Like, they found the perfect format to get the sort of mood and like thing that is happening across, and me trying to use only words to explain it to you is like literally like explaining a joke. Like, you're losing something in the
Right.
translation, which I think is really great. That's why I like the sequence so much, is I realized I couldn't explain to you why I liked it so much. It's like, I mean, look at it.
It's a comic.
It's a comic. It's doing
comic
a good
stuff.
job.
Yeah.
And I also specifically want to highlight the lettering here. Both like sort of the shape of the balloons, the sort of thin uniform line connecting them. You'll see in that last spread, there's only 2 very small balloons on there, but I would argue they don't feel awkward. It's very it feels very like natural and nice.
Mhm.
I mean, it really emphasizes that like they're part of the art, like they're part of the composition. And I think this is like a very effective way of like I think this is a very well lettered comic. It's very difficult sometimes when you have like a couple lonely balloons on a big spread like that, but I think they did a really good job here.
Yeah, and that long tail between them also really emphasizes like the duration of the time that is kind of lost in between panels.
A lot is communicated with very simple tools here, which I think is like, it's good stuff.
Yeah.
Which takes me into the next section that I want to talk about, and this is the last bit, which is lettering and voice. So I would argue that lettering is the unsung hero of comics. It encompasses, when we say lettering, mean all text elements, like the balloons, the captions, like the physical circles and boxes, or any other kind of thing, dialogue, sound effects, like that's all kind of under the umbrella of lettering.
Yeah.
And it could also, I would say things like chapter headers are often part of that. Sometimes even the page numbers, depends on like the nature of the comic, but like text of the page is all part of it. And I think that if you're looking at a comic that you're like, the art is beautiful, the color is great, it feels amateur somehow, like what's up with this comic? Why? It's probably that the lettering is bad. It's probably that the lettering was not given as much attention as the rest of the comic. And
Yeah.
that might be because the person who drew it wasn't really thinking about it. Might have been because a bad letterer was hired by the publisher. That is often the thing that's like niggling. If you're not like a comics person, but you just feel like something's off, a lot of the time that's what's off. Either it's just badly done, it's a mismatch between the font, like a weird font was chosen, the art is really fluid, but the lettering is very rigid, like we were talking earlier, the Prince and the
With panel
Dressmaker.
borders and
Yeah, it's you have to respect lettering. It's important.
Mhm.
Letterers are very important.
Yeah, and when
Um,
we were talking about this earlier, you said that people often like good design. People often only notice lettering when it's done poorly, which is
It's-
great disservice.
It's so true.
Yeah.
Lettering is an incredibly powerful communication tool in comics, and I think a lot of people don't take it seriously. I think a lot of people just think it's, oh, you're just putting the dialogue on the page, or you're just putting the captions on the page. It's much more sophisticated than that.
Yeah, and
Even if it's just dialogue, there's
Right.
nuances to how that's going to be.
right, and the placement of word balloons alone. So one thing I would love to enact as a mandate is if you're going to edit or write comics, you have to draw them.
Yes.
I think the other one is, even if you're not lettering your comic yourself, in the final letters, you have to leave space for the lettering at the earliest possible step
Think
that you
about where
can.
it's gonna
It's
go.
part of the artwork. It's part of the artwork too. This is a lesson I learned the hard way. The first mini series I ever worked on, I was also lettering. I had never done a comic on a production timeline before, and I messed up a lot and had to cover a lot of artwork. So now I draw the balloons in way back at that messy layout stage so that I know not only where they're going to go for a leave room for the art perspective, but also because they're part of the artwork and they are a compositional tool. And if you're thinking about them as early as possible, that means you can really use them to their fullest extent.
Practical side note, by the way, if you're making comics, especially if you're making them as part of a team with other people, I would recommend putting your balloons in your captions, like any lettering element, on a new page and putting some art behind them. It will save you a lot of time in the long run to be able to move it around and fix things without having to like completely redraw
Yeah.
your thing. Like
Yeah.
if you're making a mini comic, do whatever you want. But if you're doing something where like another person's going to be involved, you think there's any chance you're going to be wanting to edit things or add balloons, take balloons out, to do them on a separate layer. You don't have to draw very much. Put something behind them.
Yeah. It can just be a flat, it can be a flat tone. You can do a screen tone on there, but
just
like
something.
yeah.
You'll thank me. So anyway, let's talk about some specific lettering. So I want to talk about, I'm gonna actually talk about 2 different pages of this because I like this comic so much. This is Dibbit and Boo. So Sarah Getter is, I think, one of the best comics letterers that I know. She takes it so seriously. She thinks about, she does it by hand whenever people let her, basically. She finally got talked out of doing it for graphic novels because it was literally a nightmare. But like,
well, on the edit side.
well, no, because she also had to fix everything.
Yeah.
It's pain.
Yeah, the edit side. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But she loves hand lettering. She does a really great job. And Natalie Reese did the color for this, which I think Natalie has a really good job of like elevating and accenting the already really great choices that Sarah has made.
Yeah.
So there's a ton of stuff. I'm just going to kind of go through this and sort of point out some things about this that I like. What I love especially is that, like, you know, so there's a bunch of examples of sound effects here. There's the hiss snarl in that first panel. There's like chomp, there's a wham, there's a boff. What I love is that like this really emphasizes that like sound effects are whatever you want them to be. I love just a verb. I love a verb as a sound effect.
Yeah.
I think it's a very funny joke that never gets old to me when you just like use increasingly specific real word verbs as sound effects, like project or like pick up.
I
Yeah.
I am grateful to the Into the Spider-Verse movie for popularizing bagel. So I think even if you've never read a comic, you get that, like, yes, this is funny. It is a funny joke.
It's a very funny joke.
Yeah.
But also I think that it's important to be thinking about like where the sound effects. I'm really bad at sound effects, like as an artist, so I have a lot of respect for people who are good at them. Like they're part of the art. So I like, for instance, I love the hiss snarl in that first one. I think it's such a great example there. And also you want to think about like with anything else, like what's the quality? How do you want the sound to feel?
Right.
So like you'll notice the hiss snarl has like a kind of like a crunchiness to it. Like the chomp is a little bit more chonky. The wham has like kind of like it's like a little like a hatching at the bottom. It makes it feel, it's the mouth feel. It makes it feel different.
There's the great linguistic experiment about Kiki and Booba. It's spelled Bouba, which is like people across a variety of languages and cultures kind of universally associate sounds with like a shape. So like spiky, hard sounds tend to be like hard consonant k, Kiki, and then soft, curvy shapes tend to be Booba. Anyway, you can use this in your lettering. Yeah, it's also a fun way to say Booba a bunch of times.
That's great. And I also love that there's lots of different qualities in like the word balloons. Like, you know, you can express uncertainty by having like more or less like waveriness to the outline. You can express urgency by having it be sharper, like the 2 Ralphs in the top. You can express, and like the bottom of the me neither, it's both wavery and emphasized to emphasize that like I am panic shouting right now, which I think is like really great. Like and it's just very effective. And also Natalie's made some good choices here, like the 2 Ralphs being yellow, I think gives it very specific, makes the panel feel differently in the green. It's kind of like an uneasiness to it that I like. Often Natalie likes to have if there's 2 characters talking, she'll have the background of one of them be at least slightly different. You see one's like very light blue. It just helps differentiate who's talking, just visually helps split them, especially when the balloons are close to each other. So good stuff here. Also, this is a great example of a mix of like literal and emotional color. Yeah. So, and here's another great bunch of other good stuff here. I think I love the second panel on the top thing of the no divot. I'm talking about a really big spider. There's a ton of stuff going on here. I love the hatching in the balloon. I love the very different lettering sizes. I was talking to Carey the other day. I love that, like, because it's like a slightly weird, it's both very clear reading order. Like, you know, you can read very clearly. There's no doubt what this says, but it's like a little bit, it's not neat lines. Like, we're very good at reading. So if things are in tidy lines, we will thoughtlessly, effortlessly just like read them and not think about it. But if you mix it up a little bit, you become aware of what you're looking at, like the letters as like the words as like objects on the page in a way that you aren't otherwise. So it's kind of neat. It's a neat effect.
Yeah, it slows you down and makes you actually pay attention to like the word as sound effect in addition to the word.
There's a lot of cases like using color for emphasis, like the huge spider being in red. I mean, it seems obvious, but like it's a tool, and it's nice because you're thinking like, when is the moment where I want to break this out of my toolbox? If you do that on every page and every single panel, obviously it's gonna, that can be a joke. Like, if that's the joke is that somebody's dialogue always has one word in red, like that can be a funny joke, but like it's a choice that you're making. And I love that the lettering in the last panel on that first row, where it's kind of filling the page. This is one of my favorite tricks to do. I love it when you fill a panel with text. I think that we kind of, subconsciously understand that necessarily the specifics of what being said are not important. By making the lettering feel like part of the background, it gives that sense of like somebody is just talking at you and you are enduring it,
Right.
which is very much what's going on. Is you can read all this dialogue, but it's less about the specifics of what's being said and more about the effect of like the overwhelming unrelentingness, and also the fact that like this person's trying to ignore it, it's just filling the space.
Right.
Like, I really love that. And also the final thing I specifically want to point out on this page, which Sarah and Natalie do it a lot of their comics, and Carey, you do a version of this in Adventure Zone, which is if you want to add clarity about who is talking, put a face, put a little dog face. The first panel of that second row, you got a little dog face in there. You know who's talking. And also you can add a little bit of acting in there, which I think is really cute.
It's tone of voice in even when the character is off screen.
And when Carey in the Adventure Zone, sometimes when there's characters talking up, Carey makes little like icons that represent different characters that she'll put at the corner of the balloon to make it clear who's talking. It's great. I think that's really smart. I think sometimes people can be like, oh, but that like is like gonna kick people out of, like, no, it's just communicating information. Just make it look cute. Or bad, or make it look bad if it's supposed to look bad,
Right.
But like, or scary.
I
or
prefer
whatever.
cute, but this is again a story choice.
No, but
You
it's
should
great.
choose what works with your comic.
It's great. I wish more people did it. It's so much fun. Here's
Oh,
a
yeah.
very different
Mhm.
direction, although again, it's all about like you're creating an experience for
Right.
the reader.
A
This
bad
is,
time.
yes, this is another page from Letters for the Card of the Silent Lord. So again, most of us have at least some literacy in comics and how they're kind of quote supposed to look. And so when you deliberately go against those conventions, it's like very unsettling. Even if the person isn't thinking about it consciously, you're going to have the experience of like, oh, that's a choice.
Yeah.
That's a choice. So like by having the dialogue for the Silent Lord from like this monster be like literally in his mouth in this way, like it's clear that he's talking. Like it's very, this isn't confusing, like you know what's going on, but it's like freaking weird. It also makes the lettering into almost like an object that he's like chewing on, like he's holding in his mouth like a horrible bone. And so it makes the dialogue like a physical object in a semi-diegetic kind of way, which I think is really cool. And it gives you the sense of like the otherworldliness of this character, and the fact that you're reminded by that little sorry, like that this is not what most of the lettering in this comic is like. So the contrast is very important here. Like this is the first time in this book where you're seeing lettering like this, and he's having experience. In addition to the fact that the character is drawn, as you might remember from that earlier page that I showed, in this kind of cross-hatchy, like etching kind of way, drawn very different than the other art. Like he is separate and apart from the rest of this book, but also still interfacing with Edward here in a way he's having a bad time.
Right. It really makes it feel like it is happening. He's existing on a different plane, which, you know, in a sense, in the world of the story, he is.
Yeah.
So it's very cool.
It's by transgressing about how comic pages are supposed to work. It also feels like it's like transgressing the natural order in a way, which is very appropriate for this comic. I can't. When I first turned this page, I was like, I think I like yelled. I was like, so excited. God, it's such a nerd. Here's another comic that's doing a similar thing, but like in a different way. This is Tiger. So again, we're in an otherworldly space. Again, the lettering is sort of emphasizing like an unnatural creatures. You'll see that a lot of it is like incorporated into and feels like it's a part of like this kind of mists and smoke and like vagueness of the space. Like you have, but then you also have balloons that are like the lettering is kind of off and disjointed and in a way that's like basically there's like gives the again the voice of the character can be communicated by the font or the hand lettering that you're choosing. I think this is all hand lettering. But because they're not attached to anything, it still gives you a sense of like this cacophony of lots of different voices. Some of them are clearly like more part of the environment, and you know, I think maybe does that mean it's more echoey? Does that mean it's harder to hear? Does it mean it's louder? Does it mean it's more inhuman? Whereas you have these kind of disembodied other voices that are in balloons, like those sound different, they feel different in your head. And then in this last page, where you then have two of those kind of style balloons be attached to a specific character, you're then moving from like the vagueness and disorienting space, you know, noticing like, you know, first in the second page, you see him like grab her arm, And then, so which is like point number one of like being grounded in the specificity of like, instead of this big vague space, a specific other person has come into it. And then the third thing, the way that the lettering does it, it completes the process of like, you've been in this vague space with vague voices, now you're talking to a particular person, creature, monster thing, which I think is like a really cool way. And again, like in the earlier section, you're following her subjective experience of being in this space. Like that is part of what's creating that, which I think is like really effective here. And like hand lettering is difficult. Not everybody's cut out for it. I would say that if you do comics, like try to hand letter as much stuff as you can. I think this is somebody who's very lazy and bad about it. Because because it will.
It's hand lettering is a really powerful tool. Yeah, I will say, save your wrists, be deliberate at what you choose to hand letter, and save it for when it
I
really
wouldn't do all the
counts.
dialogue,
Yeah.
but for stuff like the
Sound
like,
effects like this, it is amazing. And again, I think the effective choice, even more effective because of the contrast.
Yeah.
This is much simpler than that, but this is also a value reversal in the lettering. So outside of this dreamscape, luckscape context in Tiger, all of the other dialogue is black letters on white balloons, and this is a reversal of that, which is also disorienting. So
we don't have an example of this, but in the Adventure Zone comics, like there's some characters that are like it's a way to indicate a character is different from other characters.
Yeah,
we
or
have some
their
characters
voice is different.
where it's like white background, but the text is a different color, or black background with like both the background of the balloon and the color of the text can communicate like
I think we even do like different color borders in balloons for different like types of voices that characters have.
And the degree to which you are moving it away from the conventions of the rest of the book emphasizes like the degree to which this is supposed to feel different and separate.
It's that context.
Yeah, exactly, which is really cool. And also sorry, we forgot to put anything like this in. Also could just be good for specificity. Like for instance, like I think if you have people talking over walkie-talkies, you can have people usually think a lot about like, oh, then it should have like electric jagged balloons, but also you can have the balloons be a different color. You can have the border be a different color. You can have text be a different font. Like you can communicate a lot of information, even subconsciously to your reader, by the lettering choices that you make, and add a lot of clarity and specificity to your comics. So that's it. That's the end of my bit of this.
Great.
Back to Carey.
Carey's closing thoughts. I mean, we've said a lot of this already, but I just want to close with like a couple of thoughts on ways to expand your comics toolbox. And again, not every tool is right for every setting, and not every tool will feel like a good fit for every person or even any specific comic. But I think trying out a lot of different things really expands your toolbox and your arsenal and gives you a lot more to work with. So one thing to do is to read a lot of comics by a lot of different artists. And if you run into something that feels successful, think about what the artist did, why it resonates with you, and then try to guess what the thinking was behind that choice. What were they trying to convey, and then what tools did they use to do it? And very, very what you're eating, as I said before. So read books, watch movies, watch TV, go to museums and look at paintings, listen to music. Like, I really think you want to take in as much different kinds of storytelling as you possibly can, so that again, you can like digest it and it can play around with whatever is already living in your head and expand that toolbox even more. And then lastly, I think the most important thing you can do is make a lot of low stakes comics. So yeah, give yourself permission to make bad comics, because bad comics are a big idea.
If you are a person who is a fan of things and likes to draw, I feel like fan comics are a great way to play, because worst case scenario, you had a good time, and best case scenario, you have a good time that you like looking at and other people also like looking at. And it's like, again, very low stakes.
Yeah.
And you're having and I think fun is very important and easy to lose track of.
Yes.
Because comics can be very grueling, and it's very important to figure out how to find and keep fun. Carey does it by putting a lot of dumb jokes in her comics.
It's true.
And by dumb, I mean amazing.
Thank you. But yeah,
a lot of dragons, a lot of background dragons.
A lot of background dragons.
A lot of puns.
But Ben is absolutely right. You really have to figure out, like, you're right, you have to bribe yourself, because comics are so rewarding and so cool, but they can be really challenging. And that means you have to find a way to connect up with what brought you to make them in the first place, which often is like, what do you love about drawing? What do you love about writing? How can you really lean into it and be on your bullshit and make stuff that you're excited to work on?
Like anything worth doing, it's going to be work at some point if you do something sufficiently ambitious. But I think it's very important to, I think that there's a way that we can frame things in terms of like what you're capable of and pushing yourself as hard as possible. Whereas I think it's actually better often practically to follow what you enjoy and what is fun for you. If you hate drawing horses, don't make yourself draw a comic that's full of horses.
Right.
If you love to draw motorcycles, go on
for
my
it.
goddess.
Yeah.
Like make a whole put motorcycles in it. Like
Yeah.
I think that's because it will be more fun for you to draw, and by making it more fun to draw, it will be more fun to read.
Right. Yeah. God. Yeah. It really shines through when somebody is
Really
doing
on
a
their
thing that they
bullshit.
love
Just like
about.
lean in
Absolutely.
fully.
And I said this before, but I will say it again. I'm a huge proponent of there being no such thing as a technically good drawing. Again, a drawing is good if it is successful in saying what you want it to say and doing what you want it, communicating what you want it to communicate.
XKCD is one of the most successful webcomics of all time. It is literally stick figures.
Yeah, so like make comics. There's no reason not to play around, have fun, make a fan comic, make a short comic, make a bunch of fast and tiny comics, make a one-page mini. Just make them. They're really fun. Comics are a powerful storytelling tool, and it is such a wide toolbox. And that's pretty much it from us. But we're excited to see what you make in the future. And we're gonna move to question and answers. Do you have our questions?
I thought I did.
I
I'm
can
gonna
also
find it.
open our questions.
I will find it in the email that Carey sent us.
Oh, I got it. We can just, the slideshow will end. I am ending the slideshow.
Found it.
I found it. I beat you to it.
Oh no, this is the different thing. I don't have it, maybe.
I have one question.
Wait, no, here. I found it.
Okay, it's also here. If
Okay,
you want to
fine.
see it, it's also here.
Great. Yeah, so if you have questions, Carey will be putting them into the doc.
Here
Now's a
they
great time to
come.
put them in the chat. We are not looking at the chat because we can only pay attention to like 3 things at a time.
Yeah.
Carey, we want to point at a thing if you want to answer any of
Here's
these.
one for you about what we don't talk about, which I'm gonna come back up to. A tiny non-panel in that ribbon divided page. So we have a question that asks, I'm gonna see if I can share the screen again.
Oh yeah.
Um,
I think it's just a composition thing.
I think
So
we got to read the question.
Yeah, the
first,
question
yeah.
is, do you have any thoughts about the choice on what we don't talk about to have a tiny non-panel in that ribbon divided page? And I would say that Charlotte sat down and thought about like what's going to make this page look good, and what made it look good is to have it be solid color divided by this ribbon. And she could have had that lower left-hand corner, which I assume is what this person means, be white.
Mhm.
But instead it's more like this is sort of like a series of full bleed panels that have like a ribbon going through it. So it's really just about composition. Like you have to think of what the page is going to look like.
Yeah. I can see a world in which like maybe you extend the ribbon just so it covers up that end corner. In this
But I
case,
think
I
ribbon
like
looked
what the
good.
I like what the solid color is doing against the rest. Like it balances out that page a little bit.
And I think basically like what you're asking yourself is like, is this confusing? Is this going to confuse the reader? Like,
Right.
is somebody's eye going to trip on this in a bad way? And I think if she'd put any detail in that, it would have done that. But I think
Right.
by having it be a solid color, your eye just kind of
Yeah.
moves over it. So it's fine.
I want to answer, and please
No,
help
please.
me. What's your strategy for hitting a point in a comic where you have to draw something you struggle to draw, such as a busy street scene? First off, ask yourself, do I really have to
Do you
draw
really
this
have
thing?
to?
Do you really have to? Could
Especially if you wrote it.
perhaps, if you wrote it, could that take place perhaps somewhere else? If you didn't write it, could you perhaps add an inset panel focusing on a character's expression who is walking through that street scene, which might conveniently cover up a large percentage of the crowd, thus that you don't have to draw it?
Is the street important?
Right. I think there are plenty of times when it is important to draw the environment or background, and that is when it matters to your story or is giving you more information about context. So if you absolutely have to draw the street scene, great, Godspeed. I think look up a lot of reference. Not just of street scenes, but also of ways that other artists have handled that kind of a crowd scene, and look at the tricks that they're using, because again, hand health is finite, life is short, like you can't spend 20 hours on every panel. So can you cover up the foreground with like an interesting detailed object? Can you hang some street flat flags? I don't know what those are called. Can you hang some flags back and forth that cover up a big chunk of the crowd?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Banners or whatever.
Banners,
Also, like cheap detail. Look
Yeah.
at look at other comics.
Right.
If you look at especially French comics, I think are like really, and Tony Cliff's. No, but like I feel like there's a way in which like no, but I think there's a way in which like people who draw comics that look really detailed when you look at it at first, but draw them very quickly.
Yeah.
If you actually look at the background, a lot of detail is suggested. It's
And-
not actually drawn in.
I think that's the most effective way to do like a big crowd scene, because it often is bad informational hierarchy management to draw everything at the same level of
You
detail.
don't zoom all the way in and draw
Yeah.
every single window.
No. That is going to distract the reader way more than it helps. Don't draw every tile on every roof. Don't draw every brick in every wall. Like you want to be selective and deliberate in choosing where the focus of your panel
Yeah.
is and how you can draw the reader's eye through the page.
Studying other people's comics, I think, are really
Yeah.
helpful for this.
Yeah.
And also, cheat.
Yeah.
Guess what? If you take a photo or if you make a model in Google SketchUp or whatever,
Yeah.
there's that, it's not plagiarism if you trace it. And I am a big fan of like taking a photo of a city street. And I don't think you should trace it like all the way most of the time. I don't think it'll look weird in most comics, but it's really great to just sketch in the rough shapes of things,
Mhm.
and then you can decide how you want to fill in the detail. But I
Yeah.
think it makes it less intimidating.
Right.
If what you are intimidated by is like, I am a cartoonist where I really like to draw facial expressions and acting, but in this panel, I really need to draw a city street, and it's important that it look like a city street. What do you have to prove? That you have like perfect 3-point perspective? Like, who cares?
Yeah.
Do you live in a city? Can you go outside and take a photo of a city street that looks kind of like it, and then like use that to set up your anchor points, and like then fill in the detail in a way that looks good and matches your art? Do that.
Or build a silly model out of matchboxes. I learned Blender so that I could make myself little
Yeah.
sets and move a little camera around in them to get that first step of layout down. My last thought is the other thing that helps a lot is when you're drawing something that you struggle to draw is to find a hook for yourself. So often that can be a bribe. Like I will actually put like, I want to draw a stupid dragon drawing in the background of whatever panel I'm drawing, or I'm going to draw a weird little prop, and that's going to be a fun way for me to convince myself to keep working on this.
Mhm.
So bribe yourself and cheat.
I can't state enough that the important part that comics stick forever, and a good comic is a dumb comic. Do whatever you got to do. Don't like literally plagiarize people, obviously.
No, oh my
but
God,
like,
that is different. But
cheat,
like if
save
you're
yourself
taking
time.
your own photos or making your own
Also,
sets,
definitely, I cannot recommend enough drawing backgrounds in the second layer and reusing them as much as possible. Like if you can get away with it and you can't tell, especially if it's like a big background, you can like slice it up
oh
differently.
yeah, this is the animation, the animator in you speaking of.
No,
Yeah.
100%.
All right, I picked that one. You pick a question.
I want to do the want to make comics but go through constant burnout, because I feel that one. And I would say that burnout is to a certain extent inevitable. Like if you make comics professionally, you will probably end up in a situation where you get burned out because you're a human being and stuff happens and it's hard. I will say that in my experience, the harder you fight burnout, all you're really doing is extending the period of time in which you will be burned out. And counterintuitively, it is often better, purely like being the most ruthless capitalistic version of yourself, like taskmaster. You actually will get done faster if you take a break and are kind to yourself and recover than if you push through it. In my experience, pushing through burnout will only make it worse and extend the amount of time that you're in hell.
Yeah.
It's usually better for most people to give yourself a break, and that looks different to different people.
Yeah.
But in terms of like, if you're experiencing it constantly, and I understand from personal experience how hard this is to do, is really take a step back and look at literally every part of your process. Like, what hours are you working? How many days a week are you working?
Right.
Are you working the same hours every day? Are you doing a catch as catch can? Are you setting aside time deliberately? Are you like doing it in weird? Are you up in the middle of the night? Are you forcing yourself to do it at a certain time of day because a friend of yours said that that's the best time to do it? Or are you doing it when you naturally feel like doing it? Like, are you trying to take care of a small human at the same time? Like, and also like think about like how many pages are you expecting yourself to draw? How much detail are you putting on those pages? Like every single part of your work and your life that are connected to this, really look at all of them and be like, think about whether or not you're being helped or hindered by the choice you've made there, or do you need to do it that way?
Right.
Is that the best way for you, or are you just doing that because somebody else told you to do it that way? Like, I mean, we could have an entire hour-long talk just about this.
Yeah.
But like, I think that sometimes we can be unconsciously making assumptions about what our work and our life should look like, and forcing yourself to do it that way. If you, for instance, just told somebody, yeah, I can draw the comic in a year, and you are constantly destroying yourself, you can't draw that comic in a year.
Right.
And the earlier you have that conversation with your editor, the better,
Yeah.
because like there's a reality to what you can do.
Yeah. I think being realistic with yourself about, and being kind to yourself
Yeah.
also about, I think a lot of this pressure comes from capitalism, which is bad for everybody.
Yeah.
But everyone's life looks different, everyone's work-life balance looks different, and the amount of time that everybody can spend on comics looks vastly different. Like you might have 2 jobs, you might have a partner you're caring for, or like a loved one or a dependent, and that all really affects like how much time in your life is going to be comics time. So I think being gentle with yourself when you assess, like, okay, like how much time can I spend on this in a given week? What is a thing that I can get done like in this month? And maybe like starting small, I think is the other concrete thing that has helped me a lot when I've been feeling burnt out, is like give myself permission to like step back and be like, you know what? I don't think I can finish this 50-page comic. I'm going to make a 1-page mini this month just for me. And I think leaning into being on your bullshit. Again, this is all very different. Like this is about assuming that comics are not your day job and you're making comics kind of as a personal practice or something you want to make for yourself.
Yeah.
I think really leaning into like, do something you love, make that comic about something you love, because there's only so much time we have on this earth.
It's true.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's
yeah.
I'm gonna cheat
hard.
and pick a second one because I really
Please.
I think we both want to talk about this, which is the what's your advice to people who feel artistically they're not up to par and still want to tell stories and illustrate them by themselves? Do it!
Make those comics, make those comics, make those comics. Again, like there is no par. Like who said that? Who told you that that was a thing? That's simply not true.
I think there's two different questions,
Yeah.
right? There's like the question of can I make a living doing this?
Mhm.
And this question of can I just do this?
Right.
There's so many factors and whether or not you can make there's people who are amazing, like life-changingly good artists who have never successfully been able to regularly make a living drawing their art for all kinds of reasons. And there's people whose art is like complete bullshit and like are giant bestsellers. And
Yeah.
it's arbitrary and it's not your fault.
It's
And you-
arbitrary and wrapped up in a network of like real privilege and real
and there's only so much
structural mess
control, and that's a whole
yeah,
separate conversation. But assuming that
beyond our
like
scope.
you just want to make comics, literally just make comics. And I think the best thing is to be really conscious of like what you want out of this and make choices that are going to help you get there. Like, is what you want to have readers, right? If what you really want is to have as many people read your comic as possible, make a comic that is something that you think people will want to read. Like be thinking maybe about the topic then. Make comics that are like educational about a topic you know a lot about. Make fan comics, make things that are fun to read, make stuff that like think about like what's fun for you and what's interesting to people that you know, and like lean into that. If your goal is to have people read your comics and talk to you about them, if your goal is to just like get your feelings onto paper and like really like get into your id and like draw really messed up stuff just for you, literally do whatever you want.
Let's do it. Yeah.
Right. I think that when people make themselves miserable is when there's a mismatch between what they want out of the experience
Right.
and like the choices they're making about how to spend their time. And that can be tricky, right? Because like at the end of the day, if you're making comics yourself, you should be making them for yourself. But I think most of us have like 5 or 6 different comics we could be making at a given time. And I think looking at all the potential comic let babies in your head and picking which one you want to like nurture into a comics tree, make that decision based on like what you want out of this, right?
Yeah.
And be selfish about it. If you're making it for
You have to.
yourself,
Yeah.
be selfish and like be honest with yourself too, in your own heart. Nobody can judge you, and thought crimes are fake, right? If what you want is attention, do something that will get you attention. If what you want is to just be ugly and weird, do ugly, weird comics and screw everybody else. Don't show anybody. You don't have to show your comics to other people who don't want to.
Well, that's what I was going to say. Is I feel like the other thing that can be really freeing is to like set aside a sketchbook that you promise yourself you're not going to show to anybody else, and like really spend some time playing around in there. Because I think like disconnecting what you want to make from the expectations you feel you should be meeting can be really hard. And especially when like a lot of the pressure is like, well, I have to post this on, I'm going to date myself by saying place this on Tumblr, and I have to get a lot of
Still on
notes and
Tumblr.
reblogs. I hope so. God, I miss
My
Tumblr.
kids are
Let's
still on
all
Tumblr.
quit
They're just
Twitter
gone
and go
feral.
back.
It's just Tumblr's just gone feral.
Good for Tumblr. That's how it should be. But anyway, I feel like there's a lot of pressure to make things that are shareable and get engagement.
Yeah.
And therefore having a setup where you are just making stuff for yourself and you promise you're not going to share them with other people can be a way to like assess what is actually resonating with you without that set of expectations on it.
And I think also finding community is really
Oh my
important,
God.
because if you find people who vibe with you, like you really, it's shocking how few people you really need to feel really good about making work and sharing it with other people. It does not have to be very many people, right? Like think on a human scale, like find your people who are into the same stuff as you, share work with you, like collaborate with them, trade minis with them at shows, like find those people and pay attention to them. Because I think that sometimes there can be this temptation to aim for like the largest possible audience, but that's not going to make most people happy.
Yeah.
Like,
And I think COVID has made a lot of this harder. And like, I have not been to shows in a long time, but I think when I was first I had a day job in psychology before I jumped ship to comics. I think the thing that helped me the most as I was starting out was going to shows in person, volunteering at shows, because then you get in for free, meeting other people and seeing the vast range of comics that are out there. I think mini comics and zines are a great way to get a broader slice of like who's making what kind of exciting and strange and weird out there work than you're going to get even looking at like Webtoon or like Twitter, because often what you see is what the algorithm feeds you, which is stuff that is already getting a lot of engagement, and that's not a representative slice of like whatever. I know the slow death in your eyes, I feel it. That's not a representative slice. So when we get back to a place where we can all safely go to cons again, like I can't wait to go buy all of the dollar minis in the entire FlameCon room like next year and just see what cool weird stuff people are making. It's really fun. Comics and zines are great.
A couple of people have asked about format. One of them was asking about size to make canvas for reading on mobile. Another one was layout differences between comics versus web comics versus printed comics. This is a great question. We cannot answer this because we don't know what you want to do.
Yeah. There's a couple of textbooks that talk specifically, like I think even Scott McCloud's new book talked about like the infinite canvas of web comics versus like the traditional printed page for the question that's about web comics versus print comics specifically.
If you want to make a comic for mobile to be read in a specific format, whether that be on mobile, on a particular website like Webtoon, or in print, if you are able to do all the research on that first, and then set up your templates, you can fix it later, but it can be a nightmare. And that goes from everything from I want to print a mini comic on and staple it to I want to post my comic on this very specific website. Any of those sites will have templates and will have that information. It might take a little while to find it if it isn't very well designed, but it does exist. If you are having trouble finding it, find somebody whose work is already in that venue and ask them about that specific thing. If you're working with a publisher, they will have templates for you. And if they don't, ask them to make one for you, but definitely do that. I would argue before you even start seriously thumbnailing, because the ratio, like the page ratio can be really big. And then also test it a lot. Like if you have a phone, look at it on your phone, send it to some friends that have different phones than you and make them show it to you.
And then my shitty, unhelpful answer would be like, I think probably before thinking about all that, like try making some comics on paper. This question asker probably already has, I don't know who asked the question, but this is in more general advice. I think even as someone who works primarily digitally, I think it is really helpful to try making a couple of like one sheet folded mini comics on paper just to get through the process of finishing and publishing a comic, even if publishing is, I'm going to steal time on my office printer at my day job to print 50 copies of this and bring it to the local zine fest. Because I think the act of finishing and publishing that work teaches you so much about like the mental fortitude of getting through the logistics of getting a comic out there. And I think that translates really well to, like Ben was talking about, the like annoying logistical administrative steps of like going on whatever Webtoon Hiveworks site and digging up their template formatting information. It's all connected skill set.
Everybody should just make one sheet minis.
It's great. They're really fun. You can trade them. You can swap them with friends. They fit in an envelope for the cost of a stamp. It's good stuff. All right.
You have one more in you?
I mean, if you see one that we have not answered and you want to tackle, I can do one more, but then my brain will become
we're running out of gas. Let's see if there's one that we have a useful answer to. Some of these we're not answering because the landscape is changing so fast that I would feel irresponsible giving it. Somebody's asking about funding for this, and I'm like, I don't freaking know. I don't know. This is a bad time for certain things, and one of them is like we're in a period of we're in a really severe period of transition in terms of like the fundamental nature of how things get paid for. And I think it'll be fine, but I would feel irresponsible giving anybody advice right now.
Me too. I think that is beyond the scope of this talk, unfortunately.
I would say I think that we should very briefly talk about the setting aside time to work on personal projects on top of professional
It's really hard. I think I had a much easier time doing that when my day job was completely unrelated to comics. So as previously mentioned, I used to work in the psych lab, and then I was not doing any kind of creative work during my day job, and that meant all of my creative juice I could put into whatever brain blast I had at the end of the day or the week. And now it's much harder. I think if you work in a design field, if you work in animation, if you work in publishing or anything that is remotely related to comics, like I think you have to be really deliberate and again, generous and gentle with yourself about like, it is likely that you might just be out of juice at the end of the day. This is true for any job, any day job. work is all work. It is all taking a huge toll because we have to do it for money because we live in a bad capitalist society. I'm going to stop harping on it, but
No,
it
it's
is a real
true.
challenge.
I think you just need to be gentle with yourself.
Yeah.
And I think that understand that like it's very personal, right? I
Mhm.
think that there are some people and who have a real joy for drawing and they like love drawing in a very like visceral way. And so when they get done doing their professional work at the end of the day, it is genuinely fun and relaxing for them to sit down and just draw a bunch of nonsense because it is like relaxing because they
Right.
can only draw the things they feel like drawing, and the act of drawing itself is fun, right? The way like I would play a video game, they draw. Does that make any sense, right? Whereas
Yeah.
for me, drawing can be like that, but for me, drawing a graphic novel was so exhausting and so constantly pushing me at the edge of my comfort zone that it really killed the joy of drawing in my heart. And I think it did an okay job, but like by the time I finished my like second giant graphic novel, I basically just like I didn't draw very much. I drew like maybe 2 comics in the next 2 years,
Yeah,
like short
burnout is
ones.
real.
I burned out really hard. I think I forgot that I could enjoy drawing,
Mhm.
right? Because I had pushed myself so far outside of my personal, like, I like this as an activity zone
Right.
that I had to like find it again. But during that whole time, I was writing a lot. I was writing stuff for fun. I was writing
Right.
stupid fan fiction that I will not tell you about.
Right. I mean, same. That was my creative outlet for the past 2
So,
years. Was
so the
fanfic,
roundabout
so.
way of being like, I think that you have to be thinking about like what your own relationship with your craft is and what your own relationship with your art is. And if it's really important to you to be having your professional work be drawing comics and that you're able to do that and that works for you, that's wonderful. But be gentle with yourself that might mean that you don't really draw personal comics outside of that professional comic anymore. It might just not be the way your brain is wired. You might have to find a different thing to do during that period of time, especially when it's really hard during the crunch time to like that might be sculpture,
Right.
that might be writing, that might be sewing, that might be baking. I think it's important to have personal things that you do that are just for you.
Yeah.
But it might not be able to be comics. And I think that it's important. And I don't say that to be discouraging. I say that to be like, be kind to yourself that you might just not be able to make it happen. And that doesn't mean that you're not. I think that people can be really hard on themselves
Yeah,
about that.
but
And if it does work
hard
for
out
you,
here,
great.
man. Yeah.
Like if you're that crazy person who can like draw a graphic novel and also draw a giant, for instance, Legend of Zelda comic in your spare time, totally picking a random
Stop.
thing, if
Hey.
that's where you are at a particular moment in time.
I will say that's 2 notes. One, Ben is absolutely right. I think if you have a hobby that becomes your day job, congratulations. But also, oh no, you fucked up and now you don't have a hobby anymore,
Yeah.
which means it is really important to find something else you can do that's creatively fulfilling that is not your day job. So one, that's really important. 2, the
Did
only
we
way
stop
that,
this? Did we stop the screen share?
yeah, but that's okay.
Okay.
I mean, we don't really need it. There's nothing
No,
relevant to it in there.
Carey texted us 18 minutes ago to say, please stop the screen share. And then
Thank you, Carey. I think Carey cut us off. Thank you, Carey.
sorry, Carey. I just saw it.
I missed
Second Carey tried to
missed
help
it.
us. Sorry, please go on.
No, my last note is I think the only times when I've been able to get over that hurdle is when I'm making something I'm really excited about, like really leaning into the beyond your bullshit stuff. So sometimes that was fan comics, and right now it's like bullshit romance comics, which are really fun for me. So I think the making time from a logistic standpoint, I think be really generous and kind with yourself and be honest about how much work you do on average
And
in a month.
schedule time for fun.
Yeah.
If you don't naturally give yourself
Yeah.
breaks, you might have to literally like if not put it in your calendar,
Oh, I
like
put
be
it in
very
my
deliberate.
calendar.
Be
Yeah.
very deliberate about it.
Yeah, and then make something that makes you really, really excited to work on it at the end of the day. Like
Yeah.
there's no reason to not do that. There's
I'm
no
trying
reason to make a comic for fun if it's not fun for you.
I'm trying to think of a not safe for work way of saying the thing I always say. Draw with your id.
Yeah, draw with your id.
Yeah.
Right. Again,
fun.
like take care of your wrists. There's only so much time you can spend doing repetitive movements before you get an RSI. So
We had a friend who started doing podfics
yeah,
when they got tired of, they wanted to do a dumb thing and their wrists were tired so they couldn't draw in their spare time. They
Yeah.
just read a lot of fan fiction, made a lot of
Yeah.
fan fiction audiobooks for their fun hobby.
Meg and I did a podcast.
The-
Like there are lots of
The
ways
world's
to
your
have fun.
oyster.
Yeah.
The bullshit ocean is infinite.
So I don't wanna swim
Take
in
a
it.
dip, have
No.
fun. So I think that's it. I think we
Yeah, on
covered
that wonderful
everything.
note, thank you all so much. Those are very thoughtful questions. This is a very fun talk to get to do. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Resistor. Are there
Thank you,
Resistor
Carey.
closing notes?
I was
that
gonna
we need
say,
to
I
do?
was gonna say to remind everybody who maybe came in late, this event was put on by NYC Resistor, which is a makerspace here in New York City. If you go to nycresistor.com, you can find out more information about the space. We have public craft nights twice a week. You have to sign up ahead of time for COVID reasons and for capacity reasons, but it is free, open to the public. We'd love to have you. We have a membership process. We do take in new members, but it involves, the first step is to come to the space and get to know us. And we'd love to have you. And makerspace and hackerspace implies like, I'm gonna do stuff with an Arduino or whatever. I do zero of that. I mostly go there and do comics nonsense.
Yeah.
And knit. Like I do only, I don't think I do any technical, like tech traditional stuff at the
Woodburning,
hackerspace right
laser
now.
printing.
Yeah, I use the laser printers. Oh, that's laser printer, the laser cutter.
Yeah, thank you,
From
laser
time
cutter.
to time.
Yeah.
Like I've done the makes. I've made the maker things.
Yeah.
But a lot of the time I'm just there to be part of the community and work on my personal projects. So
I
we're open to all.
wasn't planning on jumping in, but this is secondary Carey. I would like to say, like, for obviously we have lots of tools and a great community of people who are doing all kind of creative work. Actually, there are some people who are doing tech zines, so like there's overlap between the techie people and the comic people in that area. They were doing a feminist tech zine workshop one time, which was excellent. We also have a little printing press. So again, in terms of like tools you might want for making comics, we have that. And I also wanted to plug, this is part of a monthly series, and that we have our one scheduled for July already. And the topic on July 20th is sex games, exploring sexuality and queerness through the medium of games. They are going to talk about how mainstream media bombards us with specific ideas about gender, but that a lot of games challenge those ideas and are a great explorative space. And the person who's presenting that, Sharang Biswa, is an award-winning game designer, had a game design residency at the Museum of Moving Image here in New York, and also did an anthology called Strange Lusts, Strange Loves, an anthology of erotic interactive fiction. So again, meshing into our comics world again. So, but anyway, thank you so much to Carey and Ben for being this month's presenters.
Thank you for hosting, Carey. Thank you, Resistor.
Thank you.
All right, gonna log off.
Good night, everybody.
Bye, everybody. Thank you. Have a good night. Bye. I think when I hit end, it's gonna kick everyone out.
Yeah.
So